Good evening and welcome to Face to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Newsfirst. So we've got an election coming up in about a month, and what is going on with the opposition in this country? That's the million-dollar question, because the NPP seems to be very confident and they're moving forward and the governance seems to be getting along fine. But is it also hunky-dory, and is the opposition as divided as we are led to believe on social media? And to talk about all of these matters, we have with us this evening Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke, no stranger to our programs, and he is of course a working committee member of the SJB, the Samagi Jana Balawegya. Welcome and good evening, Kusum.
Thank you, Naresh. Thanks a lot for having me.
Good to have
having
you
me
again.
back on the show after the defeat in the presidential election.
Yes, well, somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose. In fact, one person won and 37 candidates lost.
That's right.
But let's just talk about that presidential election. Sajith Premadasa, candidate from your party, polled something like 4.4 million votes, which was only 32.76%, whereas the NPP candidate, now president, AKD, polled nearly 10 percentage points more. So what went wrong? What was because the NPP, it wasn't like they were expecting to run away with it, and the SJB was very confident up to perhaps a few days before the election. What went wrong?
Well, I think the SJB were always confident, Naresh, of being in the race. If you look at social media in the lead up to the election, many people, including media surrogates of the President Ranil Wickramsinghe, were saying that he would come second and that Mr. Premadasa would finish a distant third. As it stands, I think you can see Sri Lanka's politics as being in an extremely fluid situation. Okay, so you've had Mr. Ranil Wickramsinghe, who in general election in 2015 won over 500,000 votes, and then in 2020 he crashed to under 10,000 votes. AKD was 300,000 votes in the last presidential. He won 5.5 million votes. If you look at Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he didn't even run this time, won 6.9 million votes. If he had run, he would have gotten less than nothing, less than Namal Rajapaksa, who is the placeholder for the Rajapaksa brand, and he got less than a few lakhs. In such a situation where politics is extremely fluid over the last 5 years, you've seen one candidate receive 10 million votes across 5 years in 2 elections, and that's Mr. Sajith Premadasa. So I think one of the points you can take from this election result is that despite it apparently being an anti-establishment election, we've seen Premadasa perform extremely well and come second. In a context and a climate where people have said all 225 must go, politics of old cannot survive, in the context of an economic collapse, a once-in-a-century economic collapse where you usually see left movements perform extremely well. For a centrist party, what is considered a breakaway from an establishment party to perform as well as it did, I think it's quite commendable. Of course, there were mistakes made in the campaign. I don't think anyone can deny that. Were we confident of winning? We were never 100% confident of winning, but we knew we had a chance. But I think the fact of the matter that there were votes taken away by Mr. Wickramsinghe, there was I think it's fair to say there's been some messaging issues in the SJB. I don't think our public relations campaign has been as good as it should be, and I hope that we can rectify that in time for the next election. The other thing I'd say is that, as you said, the NPP is very confident, and I see much of the media and their surrogates in the media being very confident of a big victory, of a two-thirds majority. I'll just say that this thing is not over yet, and they're in a fight. I think they know they're in a fight, and I think that while AKD is specifically a very charismatic leader with rhetoric to match the occasion, I don't think the NPP meets that level, and I think many of the candidates will struggle to meet that level.
Now, Kusum, let's talk about the Ranil Wickramsinghe factor in the presidential election. Did it surprise you and the SJB that he polled 17%? Did you expect
For
much
me
less?
personally, and many of the analysts that I've spoken to, yes, that was definitely, we didn't expect. I was thinking 1.5 million votes, maybe 1 million votes. Anything over that, and I knew it would be difficult for Mr. Premadas to win. But of course, some of the survey data from the exit, from the results have been quite interesting, because it shows that, some part of his vote base, at 2.3 million, were former Gotabaya Rajapaksa voters, who would probably never have voted for such as Premadasa. But there was a constituency in his base which were pro-Aragalaya. And I think you could say this might broadly be centre-right voters, could broadly be, centrist voters who just felt Mr. Wickramsinghe was a better candidate. Now, that's the kind of place where the SJB lost out on, because we clearly had to put a lot of distance between ourselves and a very unpopular incumbent government, an incumbent government that didn't have any public mandate. So I felt that while, of course, our main rivals was the NPP, the votes that we were fighting for were perhaps more with Mr. Wickramsinghe. Having said that, I don't think, had Mr. Wickramsinghe not run, given the 1 million or so difference between the two, I don't think it would have been enough, but it would have made it a lot closer. And I think that's what's going to happen in the general election, where there's going to be a certain amount of coalescing around the Liberal SJB against the centre-left NPP. So that's really where the battle is going to be in the general election.
Now, you spoke about mistakes occurring during the campaign. And yes, mistakes do happen. But for a party which is as mature as the SJB, which is, after all, the breakaway faction from the UNP, it's not like it was a completely new party with new people being set up. Is it fair to say that these mistakes were rather unpardonable, given the level of experience in the SJB? I
think while the personalities and candidates and the presidential candidate of the SJB is experienced, I think the party apparatus, the machinery, it's a new machine. It's a completely new machine. Even the NPP has the JVP to fall back on. The SJB doesn't have the UNP network to fall back on, because the UNP is still very much active. And that's one of the things I think it's important to place this result in the context of the SJB being a brand new party, essentially a 4-year-old party. And unlike the NPP, which is a 6-year-old party or a 5-year-old party, they don't have the JVP's network to fall back on. The SJB is essentially a completely new brand. It's not like the SJB's also taken up a centre-right positioning of the UNP. It's actually sort of formulated its own position on Sri Lanka's political spectrum. And that presents its own challenges. And I think this may be a more long-term process, whereas if we had taken up all the positions of the previous UNP, I don't think we'd have a long-term project to look at, because you can see where the centre-right in Sri Lanka is at the moment. There is literally no centre-right. So in that sense, I think some of the mistakes, especially related to the system and the machinery, the party machinery, is acceptable. Some of the other mistakes are tactical mistakes, strategic mistakes, and there'll be enough analysis of that. I'm sure you will have members of the NPP and the UNP and the SLPP with you to discuss the shortcomings of the SJB. I won't go too much into that, but I'll just say that, I'll just repeat what I said before, is that the general election is a completely different ballgame to the presidential election. The presidential election saw a complete coalescing around AKD in terms of being an anti-establishment candidate. We can agree to disagree whether he is really anti-establishment, but the push towards a new type of politics, which the NPP seemingly seems to represent, I think that really helped AKD. So whether that same dynamic follows in the general election remains to be seen. What I can see right now is that, you and I, we follow politics, quite a lot. So I think I can name, 20 to 30 members of the SJB without any problem who are running for election. How many can you and I together name from the NPP running in any district, right? Just from the NPP, I'm not talking about the JVP. If I ask you to mention 20 members of the NPP, you wouldn't be able to. And I think this is where the concern is, right? People want to paint the SJB as part of the establishment, but go name for name in the SJB and show me if they were part of the Gotabaya coalition that destroyed the country. Show me if they were candidates with big fraud allegations, corruption allegations. Show me if some of these candidates are simply not suitable for parliament. I don't see any of that. I see, I mean, maybe you find one or two, but generally speaking, the SJB has a very strong base of politicians that are going to contest this general election.
But Kusum, aren't you afraid that now what you said may be true, but won't people be voting for the NPP brand rather than for individual members of the NPP?
I don't doubt that at all for a second, but I would again ask your audience at home if this is the way we need to conduct our democracy. Remember, this is how we ended up with so many members of the Port Tour in Parliament who had never been in Parliament and who we later found out had no business being in Parliament. If you want to know, I mean, Gotabaya Rajapaksa could not have destroyed this country on his own. He needed a huge majority in Parliament to do that. He needed people who would just nod their head, raise their hand and vote the way the party says to vote. Now, in the NPP, I would invite members of the audience to go ahead and research these members of the NPP before you vote for just the party, because we are in what is essentially a liberal democracy. We are not in a general election. You don't just vote for the party. You're supposed to choose the personalities who will represent you as a constituent. And I think in such a situation, to vote for a party without even knowing who the names are, without knowing what their backgrounds are, their qualifications, what they've done in their lives, I think it's quite astounding that we are in such a context in Sri Lanka where, as you said, a lot of people will vote with the wave of Anurukumara Dissanayake, but I will just point out that it's exactly what happened in 2019 and 2020, and political waves often end up crashing against the shoreline and creating nothing but mess. So this is kind of what we might be leading ourselves towards.
An interesting analogy, indeed. But again, the NPP's brand seems to be getting stronger rather than weaker, whereas the SJB's, I don't know whether it's fading, but it doesn't seem to be getting much stronger. And in fact, the entire opposition, I mean, let's forget the SJB, but all the other opposition parties also seem to be splintering and having their own internal problems, which, I mean, internal problems become national problems in time of elections, and we are 30 days away.
Yeah. I mean, it's when you comment on the strength of a party, I think a post-presidential election, when the NPPs won the presidency, they will be at their strongest, right? This is the peak this is part of their peak. This is when people will start taking them more seriously, consider voting for them, etc. And when you're coming off a defeat in a presidential election, clearly there's going to be attacks on the SJB, there's going to be question marks, and rightly there should be, because if a party is the main opposition and it didn't win the presidential election, there should be questions that are asked. In terms of the party falling apart, I think there's a certain amount of media hyperbole that's in play. I think the candidate for Gampaha who resigned, Manam Peruma, I think there had been rumblings about this for some time, and as you know, I think Gampaha is a very competitive district, and I think closer to general elections, you generally see these difficult decisions being made by the leaderships of all the parties, so it's impossible to keep everybody happy. I saw a lot of conversation on social media about Hirunika Premachandra, and the fact of the matter is that she's a relatively senior politician now, and she wants a very strong showing in a very competitive electorate. So stepping down from the women's organization as she did makes perfect sense, and there's also a replacement for her in that committee. So I think this is all part of politics. I haven't personally seen internal strife to the level that is being reported in the media. Are there disagreements? Are there, dissatisfaction with certain things? Of course, that's always the case when you're coming off a defeat, and that's always the case when it's a relatively new party. But just let's wait and see in the next few weeks, because I think the NPP and the JVP has its own internal issues to manage. We're talking about a Marxist-Leninist communist party that's now trying to moderate itself into a center-left party.
Well, we'll get to that Marxist-Leninist part in a minute. Sure. But my point here is that in life, timing is everything.
Yes. And
these resignations and these rumors about the SJB couldn't come at a worse time, because you are 1 month away from a general election.
I think, Niresh, this is the time when it's most likeliest to happen, right? This is, in politics, the months after one election and the months leading to the other is where the rubber meets the road, essentially. That's where most of the tough decisions are going to be made, and that's where some people will be left disappointed, some people will be, ecstatic. The national list comes out, that's a competition on its own. I think you know about that. So this is Sri Lankan politics. This is politics in general. I wouldn't judge the SJB on just these, 2-3 weeks. I think if you go back to 2023, people were saying, the party's falling apart when Mr. Champika Ranawaka left the party. Mr. Rajasena Ratna was dissenting. People said, oh, this is the end of the party. Various personnel, Thalta AntiCorruption leaving, a month or so before the presidential election was meant to be the end of the SJB as a party. But still, its presidential candidate garnered some 4.3 million votes. So I think what's clear is that the SJB as a political force is very much here to stay. I think whatever you think of the leadership, the Premadasa brand has proven itself to be extremely powerful without having been in presidency or premiership for the better part of 30 years, right? And I mean, a lot of question marks were placed on the leadership and on the leader specifically, and I think he's taken responsibility for the defeat as much as he can. But I think everybody in the party is in agreement that this party has a lot to do with its leader, right? The leader is someone that sets the tone in this party, and I think his leadership has done very well for the SJB as a brand new party coming into politics to compete at this level. And remember, we lost the NPP, but the NPP is essentially the JVP, which has been around, for 60, 70 years. So we can't say that this is something that the SJB should have definitely defeated Kumar Dissanayake, who is a left candidate in the context of a historic economic collapse. Usually, if you look at Spain, Podemos, Italy, France, even the United Kingdom, even post-2018 in the United States, the Bernie Sanders movement was a left movement that was in direct response to an economic collapse. So I think for a centrist party to come so close to the presidency, I think that says something.
Let's talk about former President Ranil Wickramsinghe. Now, 6 months ago, he was pretty much done and dusted. No one gave him any sort of chance at all. But then, over a period of perhaps 3 months up to the election, he came on very strong. And as his star waxed, it seemed that Sajith Premadasa's waned. And was Mr. Wickramsinghe eating into Sajith Premadasa's and the SJB's vote base?
I like we discussed, to some extent, I think. Did it make up for the entire difference between Mr. Kumar Dissanayake and Mr. Premadasa? I don't think so. Personally, the less we speak about Mr. Wickramsinghe now, the better, because I think it's time to finally resign him, to the end credits of a movie. The fact of the matter
he's
is
still
that,
around.
Yes, and the fact that Mr. Wickramsinghe's whole presence in this election was about ensuring that Mr. Premadasa didn't win. Because for Mr. Wickramsinghe to have any chance of surviving in our politics, he needs to make sure that the SJB doesn't consolidate the entire voter base of the UNP. And
but
the
was
centrist,
it a surprise?
base.
Was it a surprise to the SJB
Look, I
that
think
Mr. Wickramsinghe came on so strong?
I think if you're an incumbent presidential candidate, you are the incumbent. You have the power of the office. You have the power of the podium. You can make national addresses anytime you want. You can dole out properties and lands to people. You can cut the electricity, the fuel price, the electricity price. You can do a lot of things to gain votes. You have a very strong media surrogacy network around Mr. Wickramsinghe, as you well know, with his print media, with his television media. He has his supporters on the media. And I think there's a certain, to be fair to our viewers, I think there's a certain contingent in Colombo, in certain parts of the country, that for whatever reason weren't convinced with the SJB. I think we have to face up to that fact. But the good thing about politics is there's always election coming up, and there's always a chance to win them back. And I think that's what the SJB is doing. I think you'll see in our campaigns in the next few weeks, some of the candidates we have are frankly excellent candidates. And I think if you were to name the top 10 potential MPs, a majority of them would be from the SJB, just in terms of expertise, qualifications, experience, what they've actually accomplished in their lives. The NPP, for all I can see, has not really presented a new kind of politics. They've got the same kinds of, they've got celebrities, actors, athletes, but added to this, they've had quite a few academics, a few thought leaders, a couple of businessmen. So, I mean, that's quite on par with everything we've seen in previous political parties as well.
So let's talk about the word Marxist or Marxist-Leninist, as you brought up earlier.
Yeah.
How would you best describe the NPP? And this is as opposed to the JVP of 1971 or the late 80s and so on, which clearly had Marxist-Leninist dogma around it. But the NPP of today, is it fair to describe it as Marxist-Leninist?
No, I mean, I didn't describe it as Marxist-Leninist. The JVP is explicitly still Marxist-Leninist. It says so on the website, and it is the main constituent party of the NPP.
You can say something on your website, but is it really?
But I haven't seen, I mean, when you've built your entire brand around the sickle and the hammer, and you have your, the pictures of Lenin emblazoned on your podiums when you have your national, programs and whatnot, you have to accept that you have some Marxist-Leninist element in it. But this is not, I mean, Marxism and Leninism is it's a political ideology. How much of it can be practiced in reality in today's modern political context is, I think, it's very minimal, right? So what the NPP has done very well is moderate this very left formation into something more, shall we say, mild. It's a mild form of leftism, right? And this is not uncommon. It's happened all throughout the world, especially since 2008, since the financial crisis. You've seen a lot of political parties sort of shift left just to follow their electorate, because that's generally what people want. They see, and I think AKD's discourse is very important to mention. He's been able to sort of bring up the urgency that Sri Lankan people, the middle class, the lower middle class, how much urgency they have for things to improve, right? People are impatient for things to get better. And I think he's been able to tap into that because he's a very skilled rhetorician. He has that Marxist-Leninist background, which means he's able to meld his rhetoric into those classic themes of oppression, of the state being above everybody else, about being subjugated to the state, and that resonates with people because that's pretty much what's been happening, right? On the other hand, they're trying to also advertise themselves as a new type of politics. And as I said, a new type of politics is what Sri Lanka needs. But let's talk about the NPP in the run-up to the election. One of the main things we heard about from them was this alternative debt sustainability analysis. So where is this alternative DSA? I haven't heard about it from AKD in multiple speeches that he's made. I haven't heard about it from Mr. Surya Perum, who's one of their main economic advisors. I haven't heard Mr. Handunnetti speak about it. The entire IMF, the entire team of the NPP met with the IMF and Mr. Peter Brewer. They didn't mention anything about the alternative DSA. The whole idea of the NPP was to come in, renegotiate with the IMF, renegotiate with our creditors, and present a better deal for the Sri Lankan people to give them relief. Now I'm asking you as a member of the media, have you seen any of that at all with the NPP? I personally haven't. What I've seen is more of Ranil Wickramsinghe's policies. What I've seen is them signing Mr. Wickramsinghe's debt arrangements. Now, I understand if you are saying we don't have much time to renegotiate, we'll sign this for now, and we're going to renegotiate it later. Okay, but then you should probably say that as well, whereas there's been, slight indications of this, but nothing really forthcoming. So the rhetoric has moderated significantly, and I just wonder how a left movement can moderate itself so quickly in such a short space of time with another election looming.
So are you saying that the left movement is moving more and more towards the center?
Yes, I think what we're seeing is a fight for the center. I think with the SLFP having disintegrated into 3 or 4, splinters, the SLPP essentially becoming a cult of personality, and that personality being no longer popular, that party's gone. So there's a big void in the center-left where there's some popularity. There's also a void on the center-right, but nobody wants to take that up because it's so unpopular. There's nothing in the center-right that's really attractive to a majority of people in the country. Maybe there's a small sliver in Colombo that sees, the liberalism or the neoliberalism as being the answer to our problems. Generally speaking, though, I think the NPP has moderated itself successfully. It's up to the SJB to push us on that. So as I said, if you are going to have this very strong, they had a very good, very reasonable critique of the IMF. This is one of the things that I found attractive about the NPP and about AKD's discourse in particular. But now it's all disappeared. I mean, I don't hear about it. Now it seems that they're all part of the same gang, as it were. So maybe it's time for the SJB to take a slightly more outsider point of view on this.
Now, let's look at the election coming up. Is the SJB at all confident of winning? Because the NPP definitely is confident of winning.
I think, if I sat here and told you that I'm confident the SJB wins, considering that AKD just won the presidential election, I don't think you'd believe me. I think politics is a very, very funny thing.
So is it a strong second place that the SJB is looking at?
I think we are looking at forming, at least coming close to forming an alliance that can govern the country, that can command a majority in parliament. And I think people will be very surprised when the general election comes out, because as I said, the NPP is a very thin party on the ground. The JVP is not, but the JVP isn't the party that's popular, it's the NPP. It's the NPP that's being advertised. And I've called on members of the NPP to debate and discuss their policies, their economic policies, how they've made the appointments so far, and I haven't got any take-up. So maybe on live TV I'll invite any member of the NPP who wants to have a discussion, wants to have a debate. Maybe we can have it on this channel, on this show. It's called Face to Face, right? So maybe any member of the NPP, any candidate would be willing to debate me or discuss any of the policies of the SJB. I'd be more than happy to do it. I just haven't seen anybody. Now, if you ask me the question, who will be negotiating from Sri Lanka's side with the IMF, I don't know. I mean, if it's Mr. Handunnetti or Mr. Harshana Suryaperuma, I think people can make their own minds up about that, whether they're capable enough to do this. Mr. Suryaperuma was asked a very simple question about his own party's position on the Central Bank Act, and he didn't even want to answer that question. So I'm just wondering when we're going to be, seriously putting the NPP up under the microscope and really taking a look at, some of the things that they've promised in their manifesto, because, like I said, all of a sudden the rhetoric has changed very quickly.
Yes, but is anyone going to actually put the NPP under the microscope when the opposition seems to be falling apart all the time?
Well, I think that's a narrative about the
yes,
SJB
and when I say
apart,
the opposition, I don't mean just the SJB.
No, I get it. I think one of them, I think it was actually Chatrank Abhisinghe who mentioned on a different channel that he doesn't see much of an opposition for the NPP. So I have to, I mean, it makes me wonder, right? I mean, you mentioned the NPP have done very well with their advertising, with their PR. They have a very strong candidate. We're coming off, like I said, a once-in-a-century economic collapse, but yet their candidate was unable to win 50%. Majority of the country voted against that candidate. Didn't even win the second round of preferential votes. Did not win a majority in any of the districts that have a majority with minorities. So that shows that even though they've won big in some parts of the country, there are other parts of the country, the minority parts of the country, where people just don't trust them. And I think these are all weaknesses that the SJB can exploit, and I think they will going forward. And the way to exploit them is by putting forward candidates that actually have a record in the grassroots, where people look at them and see someone that stood by them through the last 3-4 years of pure struggle for the people. And I think that will really come forward, because a lot of SJB candidates in this general election have been working in the grassroots for decades, and they have not had the kind of control over power that members of the Pohotwas SLFP have had. So these are people who you cannot blame for the current malaise in our politics and the destruction of our economy. And I think if we make that case to the people and show that, look, we understand that Andrakumara Dissanayake was a great candidate and you preferred him to our candidate, but take a look at the rest of the NPP and understand that Gotabaya Rajapaksa didn't destroy this country on his own. He had the help of a parliament. And remember that every single time we've had a large majority, a 2/3 plus majority, every single time, Niresh, our country's collapsed in that period.
I won't disagree with you on that one.
Yeah.
4 times, I believe,
Yes.
in history,
Yes.
we've had
so every
2/3.
single time we've had one party that takes over parliament completely. You lose the balance. You lose that desire or the necessity for deliberative, consultative policy making. then policy making just becomes one person on top saying, do this, do that. It's a bit like these appointments that we've had with the NPP recently. Now you have a minority government. You have 3 people running the government essentially, right? Let's take, for instance,
but that's just for a month more, or 5 weeks more.
So given that we're only doing it for a few weeks, should this government have taken Sri Lankan Airlines off the market and said we're no longer interested in divesting this asset that's been a huge burden on people, on the fiscal equation in this country? Should they have appointed a new CEO, given that they don't have control of a parliament? There isn't a parliament sitting, there's only 3 cabinet members. So what happened to the deliberative approach to policy making? Or is this just a few people in a room making decisions for the country? Again, I think everybody's given credit for some of the appointments that the NPP have made, but the others should also be scrutinized, right? So we have to ask the question, what is the criteria with which these people have been chosen? Who are the alternatives? It should be a more transparent process. That's what we were promised. We were promised a new type of politics. That's not what we're seeing.
So you're saying it's politics as usual,
I think it's
governance
politics as usual, and I think they're putting politics so obviously at the forefront, and that's obvious when you look at the BRICS summit. It's coming up, and I think Wijetilleke, I think he's the foreign minister.
That's right.
And the president have both said they're not going. And this is an organization that Sri Lanka, I think, needs to join. The BRICS is an upcoming organization, and whatever weaknesses it may have, Sri Lanka has already said, even the previous government has said, we want to join. The BRICS is representing the global south, and the NPP should be supportive of the BRICS. But instead, I understand Wijetilleke, maybe he has to, take part in the election and all that. But Nkrumah has already run his race. He's already said he's not taking up, any platform positions for any candidates. He said that he's going to stay off the platforms. So why couldn't he go for the BRICS meeting? So I think these are real questions that we have to ask of the government at the moment, because I think people are very comfortable after a victory and not really paying attention to what's quite happening, because people say, oh, look, you can run the government with 3 people. I said, even if you can, you shouldn't. That's not how a government should be run. It shouldn't be run by 3 people. It should be run by a deliberative process of people who are professionals and who have consultation with each other and then arrive at a decision, not 1, 2, 3 people. Most of them were not even elected as yet, right? So I think this is a concerning thing, I think.
What about the anti-corruption platform that they ran on? Have you seen any positive aspects
yes,
of what they've done?
I'll be very fair, Niresh. I always try to be fair on your program and not to be too partisan, right? So I think there's been a few interesting things. I think they've said they're going to reinvestigate the bond scam and a couple of the other emblematic cases, including the Easter attack, things like that. We saw a prominent member of Sri Lanka's business community remanded over a tax evasion case recently, which I think sends an important signal, whatever the...
But I don't think that has a lot to do with the government. It is something in
well, why hasn't it happened all this time?
Well, our judicial system works very slowly.
I think it was something like 3.5 billion rupees worth of taxes that have been unpaid.
That's right.
And that has to be, at least 2 or 3 years. So I think, the fact that it happened with the government change is a little bit suspect.
But I think it was the sentencing which was done today.
Perhaps.
So but the government, I would be surprised if the government had anything
I
to
hope
do
not.
with it.
We hope not, right? This is what we're asking for, a new type of politics. So I accept some of the work on the anti-corruption side has been good. But again, on the governance aspect, as I mentioned, let's take the Sri Lankan Airlines CEO. I think he's a very prominent businessman, a very respected businessman who's been appointed CEO. The chairman of Sri Lankan Airlines. But of course, I think he served on the Haley's board, PLC, for a very long time. And that is directly under the control of Mr. Dhammika Perera, who is explicitly a member of the SLPP and connected to the Rajapaksa family and their political establishment. So was that really the most appropriate appointment to make at this stage? So these, you have to ask, for example, Mr. Shani Abesekar. I think I support his work, you support his work. We believe he's a patriot. But if you're talking in governance terms, he openly campaigned for the NPP. The NPP said they won't politicize Sri Lanka's governance. But now he is, I think, head of the Criminal Investigation Analysis Bureau. So that's a government position, and that's politicization of the governance program in Sri Lanka. So I think people have to ask these questions, and I don't expect us to agree on every single appointment that the NPP makes. but I'm not seeing that much of a change to our politics. Nothing that really makes me sit up and say, oh, things are going to be different. Because what we see is Anurukumara Dissanayake and a few other people making a bunch of appointments that are under his authority. I mean, he is one of the people who has been talking about this concentration of power, right? So he has now this concentration of power, and he seems to be enjoying it quite a lot. So, I mean, I hope someone will press him on a timeline for the abolition of the executive presidency.
Well, that's the elephant in the room in the end, isn't it? Because every party which has come to power or come into office over the last 30 years has promised this, and then it sort of gets lost along the way. It happened with President Chandrika, and then with Mahinda Rajapaksa and Ranil Wickramsinghe and Sirasa, and all of them basically. Yeah. So again, with this government, with President AKD, what do you expect?
I expected more in terms of rhetoric, at least. The easy thing to do is to say what you're going to do and say after the general election we'll be looking at this very seriously. Okay, maybe it's a little inconvenient for them to give a timeline on the abolition of the executive presidency, but they can talk about it, right? They can mention this is one of the things one of the main things we have to do in Sri Lanka to improve governance is to reduce the concentration of power.
But isn't a timeline exactly what we need? Because
I think so. Yes.
Because, Kusum, in the past, the experience is that a party comes to power all gung-ho about we're going to abolish the executive presidency.
Yeah.
And then they say, well, this is going to take a little time, we have to
yes.
rewrite the constitution, etc. And then it's sort of months run into years, and then all of a sudden it's 2 or 3 years have gone by.
Yes.
And then they say, well, we need this power to run the country. And then you might go into a second term as well. So it just doesn't happen. So a timeline is what we need.
I agree completely, and I think aside from a timeline, I think the President Anurukumara Dissanayake has given quite a few addresses, and I don't think he's mentioned it. He can openly say. I think his colleague Mr. Handunetti mentioned after his inauguration that we just witnessed the last inauguration of an executive president. But we haven't heard that from the president himself. We haven't heard the president say, I will be your last executive president, because I don't think this office should exist in its current form. I haven't heard him say that. Would have been music to our ears if he did, right? So maybe, okay, I'm a member of the SJB, I'm a little bit biased, maybe I'm holding them to an unfair standard. That's why I said, okay, maybe a timeline is asking a little too much too soon. But I would have expected, just like the IMF and the DSA and the renegotiation of the debt restructuring program, at least it should exist in the rhetoric. But I just don't see it. It's something that's not emphasized anymore at all. And it's the same with the executive presidency. And let me also just remind the members of the audience that the NPP changed its position on the executive presidency and the 13th Amendment pretty late in the day. It wasn't something that they had agreed to right along. In fact, I think on one of your shows, I mentioned that the current Prime Minister, Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, on a platform said that the NPP was for the 13th Amendment. And the very next speech, Mr. Tilvin Silva came up and said, she made a mistake, the NPP is not for the implementation of the 13th Amendment. So I think just those two aspects, the executive presidency and the 13th Amendment, show how quickly they decided to moderate their position. Because I don't think they really did until even the last 2 or 3 months before the election. I think especially the 13th Amendment is such a sticky situation for the JVP, right? Which basically the entire second insurrection was a reaction to the Indo-Lanka Accord and the 13th Amendment, which came from the Indo-Lanka Accord. The JVP's rhetoric is based on a mistrust of Indian imperatives in this region and for Sri Lanka, right? This is one of the whole basis of the JVP. And now that's kind of swung wildly in the other direction. So I'm just wondering how much of this can be sustained by this new governing coalition.
Now let's talk about, you mentioned Prime Minister Harini Amarasuriya.
Yeah.
Now she is enjoying quite a lot of popularity on social media and in the media. Is that a concerning factor? Because she is leading the charge of the NPP in the Colombo district. And she is the person who Sajith Premadasa is up against in the Colombo district, and of course for the post of Prime Minister. So is this a concerning factor?
Let me start by saying that I've interviewed Dr. Harini almost 2 years ago. I interviewed her for almost 1 hour, and I found her to be a very engaging, very informed politician. I don't know if she has the requisite understanding of economics to really be a prime minister of a country that's undergoing such economic strife and with complications with our debt restructurings and IMF program. She will be a strong candidate in any district. I think she's extremely well qualified. Of course, the question mark is about experience and how much political experience she'll carry. But that's the beauty of a general election, Niresh. It's not just about Mr. Premadasa or Ms. Amarsurya. It's about a whole range of candidates. It's about the party. It's about the brand. And I think AKD himself, being so popular, being such a well-known figure in our politics, really covered up for some of the aspects of the NPP that were lacking. Because the NPP itself, I mean, people like me that read politics regularly, we have a pretty good understanding of what the NPP is. But I think a lot of people don't quite understand what the NPP is. A lot of people who are just paying attention by the by on politics, they may not even understand what the NPP represents. So I think they have a challenge in that. But of course, there's a chance, as you said, a lot of people will simply vote for the NPP because they now have the sitting president. And that's, again, I would ask the audience, you can agree with the party on every single position, but if you don't find a member of that party in your constituency who's going to stand up for you, who you believe in, who has the experience and let's say the some kind of stature in your community, then I would ask you to look around a little more at the other candidates and really consider your options, because I think simply voting for a candidate in a general election because they have the president's arm around their shoulder, I think that's a very bad situation for our politics.
Okay, let me ask you about another issue which is on social media, which is that had Sajith Premadasa and Ranil Wickramsinghe close ranks together, that they would have, or the one candidate from that combination would have over 50% in that presidential election. Of course, that's mathematics. Yes, 34%, 33% plus 17 equals 50, but mathematics is not politics. Looking at it, is there any chance of Ranil Wickramsinghe and Sajith Premadasa burying the hatchet and burying the hatchet not into each other's backs or heads, but actually coming together?
I mean, Mr. Wickramsinghe is not contesting. If he's not contesting, what is the value in the UNP? I mean, can you point me to a single member of the UNP that you think is worthy of being in the SJB, worthy of us?
But aren't you again underestimating the UNP, which is what happened in the presidential election? And the
underestimating the gas cylinder. Wasn't the UNP. I'm a UNP supporter from from the age of 18. I voted for the SJB.
It's rather difficult to remember who's in what and and so on, because there's so many combinations.
I did notice Mr. Sagar Ratnaik is running from the gas cylinder. So I think at least some remnant of Mr. Wickramsinghe's time will be in this general election. To answer your question, I think we have to first of all understand why there is an SJB in the first place. The SJB exists solely because Mr. Wickramsinghe's rule over the UNP decimated that party's popular base. The UNP, maybe that I know even, represented the centre-right business community, the urban population to a certain degree, the liberals. But if you take my mother's generation, the UNP was an everyman party. The UNP was about the working people as much as it was about the business community. That ethos of the UNP has completely been lost. And if you take the 2015-2019 period, which actually sealed the coffin of the UNP, the bond scam happened. It happened. I can't go back and make it not, I can't forget that it happened. So the Easter attack happened. It happened under Mr. Wickramsinghe's watch, right? Mr. Wickramsinghe gazetted the central bank under the Prime Minister's office, invited a personal friend, Mr. Mahendran, to take over the central bank, and then told him to leave as soon as things got a little chaotic in Sri Lanka, and that gentleman has never been back to Sri Lanka. So I don't think we can forget those things. I mean, if I were to see Mr. Wickramsinghe join an SJB platform, I would have to resign the party because it goes against everything that I've been speaking about in terms of the SJB. I mean, the SJB is a project that's so distinctive to the UNP. And it also disappoints me so much, and I'd say something about the SJB not being able to carve its own brand out successfully enough, that so many people think the SJB and the UNP can be switched one for the other. Because they're very distinctive parties. They're very distinctive ideologies. The UNP is a neoliberal party. The SJB has social democratic values and a social market economic model. These two cannot mix. And in Sri Lanka's context, what would it say if the government, the person that was running the government and his party, which was clearly unpopular, I understand that they won 2.3 million votes and they weren't expected to win 2.3 million votes. If you ask me, it's 2.3 million votes too many for that gentleman and that party. But they came last. There's no other way to say it. They came third in a 3-horse race. So does it make any sense for the SJB, already getting a lot of criticism for not having certain ideological purity, right? I don't see it as, I'm sure that there are some people who would say, oh, I would vote for the SJB if the UNP or Ranil Wickramsinghe was part of it. But then there are very many people like myself that would probably not be able to vote for the SJB in such a situation.
And on that note, I'm afraid we are out of time. My thanks to Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke, Working Committee member of the SJB. And my thanks to you at home for watching. Don't go away. The news is coming up next. Have a good evening.